It all began with a simple television interview. Millions watched, riveted by every tear, every pause, every carefully chosen word. But behind the cameras, behind the dazzling lights and the poised smiles, there was a story no one saw. A story of manipulation, rehearsal, and a father caught in the crossfire of a public spectacle he never asked to be part of. This is the story of Meghan Markle, the Oprah interview, and Thomas Markle, the father who revealed a truth that would shock the world and change everything. Imagine watching your daughter, someone you have loved, protected, and guided, sit on a global stage and declare herself a victim of a life that seemed, to you, carefully curated and privileged. You feel pride, yes, but there is also an unease in the pit of your stomach. Something isn't adding up. And when that unease turns into revelation, it becomes a heartbreak unlike anything you have ever experienced. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Thomas Markle knew something the world didn't. While audiences gasped at the confessions, the revelations, and the raw emotion of the broadcast, Thomas saw the careful choreography beneath the tears. Meghan had practiced. She had planned. Every pause, every sob, every emotional beat was not spontaneous. It was scripted. Weeks before the world ever tuned in, she had rehearsed with PR consultants, running through lines over and over, ensuring that each word would land precisely as intended. She had even recited these lines to her own father, turning intimate family conversations into rehearsal sessions for an audience of millions. To Thomas, this was more than unsettling. It was a betrayal. And then came the phone call. The call that would cement a fracture that could never be mended. Meghan threatened her father, warning him to remain silent, to stay in line, or risk being cut off from her life forever. A father who had only ever tried to protect his daughter was suddenly cast as the villain in a story that was being told on the grandest stage imaginable. Imagine that. The very person you trusted to guide your child and advise them is suddenly the one you are told to fear, to tread carefully around, and to never, ever speak again. The shock of it is almost unbearable. But it wasn't just the threat that stunned Thomas. It was the realization of what had already been done. Millions of viewers had seen the interview, sympathized with the narrative, and been manipulated into a perception carefully crafted by Meghan and her team. America believed a story that Thomas knew was incomplete, a story that had been rehearsed to perfection to evoke exactly the responses intended. The public saw a vulnerable woman, a victim of circumstances and a rigid institution, pouring her heart out. What they did not see was the calculation behind each gesture, each line, each tear. It was an orchestrated performance, designed to reshape a narrative, to manipulate a global audience, and to destroy reputations. And in the middle of it all was a father, heartbroken, silenced, and desperate to be heard. To understand the full gravity of this situation, you have to step into Thomas Markle's shoes. Picture sitting in your home, flipping through the script your daughter had practiced, realizing that words meant to be intimate confessions had been rehearsed as if for a movie role. Imagine the sense of betrayal, the mix of disbelief and sorrow, as you see the world cheering for the vulnerability that had been calculated and polished, while you know the truth lurking behind the scenes. And then, imagine the threat, a direct warning to stay quiet, a line drawn in the sand that could never be crossed without consequences. That is where this story truly begins, with a father forced into silence, and a world oblivious to the reality unfolding behind the scenes. The Oprah interview was more than just a conversation. It was a masterclass in narrative control. Thomas has described how Meghan meticulously planned every aspect: the timing, the phrasing, the pauses. Every segment was designed to build tension, to tug at heartstrings, to create a compelling story that would dominate headlines for weeks. And it worked. The media, captivated by the unfolding drama, replayed the interviews endlessly, analyzing every inflection and facial expression. Social media exploded with reactions, theories, and emotions, all feeding into the narrative carefully crafted by Meghan. But behind the glitz, the glamour, and the carefully edited broadcast, there was another story, a story Thomas felt compelled to share despite the risk to his relationship with his daughter. Think about that for a moment. A father, watching as his daughter's image is polished for the cameras, realizing that millions are being swayed by a performance, not reality. It's not just about hurt feelings or embarrassment. It's about a truth being hidden from the world, a manipulation so precise that it reaches into the hearts of viewers everywhere. Thomas's decision to speak out on live television was not born of malice. It was born of necessity, a desperate attempt to reveal a side of the story no one else could tell. He wanted the world to know that what they were seeing might not be the raw, unfiltered reality they believed it to be. The consequences of speaking out were immediate and severe. Meghan's threat was clear: cross her, and you are cut out of my life. The tension between parent and child, once private, now spilled into public view. The world, unaware of the personal stakes, focused on the scandal, the drama, and the sensationalism. And yet, for Thomas, every headline, every viral clip, every social media post was a reminder of the betrayal he felt, not just as a father, but as someone who had been silenced, manipulated, and marginalized in his own family story. Yet, in the midst of this family conflict, there is a larger narrative at play. This isn't just a story about Meghan and her father. It is a story about power, influence, and the ability to shape perception on a global scale. It is about how one meticulously crafted performance can sway millions, alter public opinion, and rewrite history in real time. Thomas Markle's revelations peel back the curtain on a world where appearances are everything, where personal relationships are used as tools for narrative control, and where the truth can be both a weapon and a casualty. As viewers, we are forced to ask ourselves uncomfortable questions. How much of what we see in the media is genuine? How often are narratives carefully constructed to manipulate our emotions, our beliefs, our reactions? And in this specific case, what does it say about a family willing to place public perception above personal truth? Thomas's story forces us to confront these questions, to examine the gap between public image and private reality, and to consider the cost of such calculated performances. And yet, even with all the revelations Thomas shared, the world continues to debate, to speculate, to pick sides. Some see Meghan as a victim, others as a manipulator. Some sympathize with Thomas, others criticize him for speaking out. But beneath the surface of this global conversation lies a deeper truth. A father who loved his daughter, a daughter who meticulously rehearsed her story, and a world watching without fully understanding either perspective. The tension, the emotion, and the drama are only the beginning. Because as Thomas's revelations spread, questions arise about the long-term impact on family relationships, public perception, and the very definition of truth in the age of media spectacle. What consequences will Meghan face for rehearsing her narrative so meticulously? What consequences will Thomas face for daring to speak out? And perhaps most importantly, what is the real story that the public has yet to see, hidden behind tears, polished statements, and rehearsed confessions? But the most shocking part of all isn't just that Meghan rehearsed, or that Thomas revealed it, or even that the world was watching every move. The most shocking part is what came next. Because once the truth began to leak, once the rehearsals and manipulations became public knowledge, Meghan didn't just shrug it off. She responded, and her response was not measured. It was a threat, a warning, a line drawn with absolute clarity. A father who had dared to speak was suddenly in danger of losing his daughter forever. And so we are left at the edge of a precipice, staring into the unfolding drama of family betrayal, public manipulation, and calculated performance. Thomas Markle has shared his side. Meghan Markle has defended her narrative. The world is watching, debating, and reacting. But what comes next? What consequences will ripple from these revelations? How will the family survive the storm they themselves created? The answers to these questions are coming. But what Thomas revealed next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Could you imagine the moment when the world cheers for your daughter, seeing her as a vulnerable, wronged woman, and yet inside, you are breaking? That was Thomas Markle's reality, sitting in the quiet of his home while millions watched Meghan's every word on that infamous interview. For a father, nothing could feel more surreal, more gut-wrenching, or more isolating. How could someone you raised, nurtured, and tried to protect betray you in such a public, deliberate way? It started with the first clip that aired. Thomas recalls the initial shock. The camera panned to Meghan, eyes glistening with carefully timed tears, voice quivering just enough to trigger empathy. Viewers at home gasped. Some cried. Many shared their outrage online, talking about the struggles Meghan had endured and praising her bravery. But Thomas knew something the audience didn't. Every tear, every pause, every sigh had been rehearsed. She had practiced the emotional beats meticulously with PR consultants. She had even read lines to him, her father, as though preparing for a movie role. And now, millions of people were witnessing a performance he had been asked to keep silent about. The pain of that realization is hard to describe. Imagine being a parent, knowing your child is performing for the world in a way that distorts the truth, yet being powerless to stop it. Thomas had warned Meghan not to manipulate the narrative. He had tried to remind her that honesty, raw emotion, and reality carried a weight no script could capture. But those words were ignored. Instead, the rehearsal tapes, the practiced lines, and the coaching sessions all played out on global television. His daughter, once the little girl who clung to his arm, had now become the orchestrator of a story that painted a carefully curated version of reality, one that served her image and her narrative above all else. What hurt Thomas most wasn't the public reaction, it was the private betrayal. He had been blindsided, cast into the shadows of a story that claimed to be deeply personal and raw. There is an irony in that, isn't there? That the very intimacy he valued, the conversations they had shared in private, were weaponized on a global stage. Did the world see the late-night calls where she recited lines? Did they know she practiced tears like a musician practicing scales? Did they know her vulnerability had been manufactured? Of course not. And that, more than anything, broke Thomas. Not for his own sake, but because he realized that the daughter he loved and trusted had chosen performance over truth. And then there were the viewers' reactions. Social media exploded with applause, commentary, and analysis. Some hailed her as a hero, some pitied her plight, but all were unaware that Thomas had been there, watching helplessly, trying to reconcile the daughter he knew with the persona the world adored. He could see every calculated expression. He could hear every pause and recognize it for what it was, intentional. America, and indeed much of the world, had been manipulated. They were witnessing not a moment of genuine vulnerability, but a carefully executed, rehearsed narrative. Thomas tried to reach out afterward, to voice his concerns to her privately. Calls went unanswered. Messages were ignored. The daughter who once confided in him had erected a wall, one built not of hurt feelings, but of strategy. She was untouchable now, a figure performing for the cameras while the man who had guided her through life was left in silence. Every unanswered call, every ignored plea, was another layer of heartbreak. Imagine the humiliation, the despair of feeling cast aside in your own family, knowing the world is celebrating what you know to be a fabrication. There's a contradiction here that Thomas could not reconcile. How could someone so close to you, someone you had loved and protected, wield your trust like a tool? How could she craft a narrative that evoked sympathy and empathy while dismissing the truth of their relationship? It wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a betrayal that had consequences for the entire family. Royal family members, friends, and acquaintances were swept into this narrative, painted either as villains or oblivious parties in a story that had been scripted long before cameras ever rolled. The reach of her actions was enormous, and Thomas, despite being in the center of the storm, had no control over it. But Thomas did something courageous. Against the fear of being cut off, of losing his daughter entirely, he stepped forward. On live television, he revealed what he knew. He spoke about the rehearsals, the coaching, the lines she had recited to him. He shared the behind-the-scenes reality, risking public criticism, media backlash, and perhaps most painfully, the wrath of his own daughter. To Thomas, truth mattered more than fear. But the price was immediate and severe. Meghan's reaction was swift and unmistakable, a warning, a threat that he was treading on dangerous ground. Speak again, and you risk losing your place in her life forever. It's hard to capture the intensity of that moment. For a father, being silenced by your child is a form of heartbreak few can understand. Imagine the person you trusted the most, the one you taught, guided, and loved, turning those very lessons against you. Imagine the mixture of anger, sadness, and helplessness. Thomas had always wanted to protect Meghan. He had hoped to offer guidance, to advise her against hasty decisions, to share wisdom born of experience. Instead, he found himself on the outside, marginalized and threatened, all while the world celebrated the performance she had perfected. And yet, despite the heartbreak, Thomas's courage cannot be understated. He knew that millions of people were being presented with a narrative carefully orchestrated to evoke emotion, and he felt compelled to speak out. The rehearsals, the coached lines, the timing, all of it painted a version of reality that ignored the complexity, the nuance, and the human truth behind their relationship. By revealing these facts, Thomas risked personal loss, public ridicule, and familial estrangement, but he prioritized honesty over comfort. How often do we, as an audience, get to see such courage? How often is the truth this raw, this risky, and this personal? And here lies another emotional contradiction. Thomas's love for his daughter did not diminish the pain he felt. In fact, it intensified it. Every revelation, every piece of truth, was like a blade twisting inside. He wanted the world to know her as she truly was, but he also wanted to protect her. The conflict was unbearable. He loved the daughter who rehearsed lines, just as he loved the daughter who had once confided in him as a child. Could these two versions coexist? Could the world accept that reality? Or would the audience forever see only the image crafted on camera, while the truth remained buried, known only to those closest to her? Thomas's heartbreak was compounded by the public's perception. The world had chosen sides, debates were raging, and social media had become a battleground. Some condemned him for speaking out. Some praised him for revealing the rehearsals. But in all of this, the human element, the father who was hurt, isolated, and fearful, was largely ignored. His perspective, rich with emotion and context, was overshadowed by the spectacle, the drama, and the celebrity of the moment. He was left to grapple with a painful truth. Being right didn't shield him from heartbreak. Being honest didn't protect him from isolation. Loving his daughter didn't prevent the personal anguish of being silenced and threatened. And the threat was real. Meghan's warning lingered in the background of every subsequent decision. "Speak again," she had said, "and you are out." It was more than words. It was a line drawn, a boundary set, a declaration of the power dynamic now in place. The father, once a figure of guidance, now found himself forced into silence. How does one continue a relationship under such terms? How does a parent reconcile love with fear, affection with risk? Thomas faced questions no father should ever have to answer. But the story did not end there. Because the world continued to watch, the interview aired. Reactions spread. Headlines screamed. Yet Thomas's revelations were only beginning to surface. The rehearsals, the coaching, the deliberate manipulation, all hinted at a larger pattern, a story about control, performance, and the calculated use of family for personal gain. And as the public continued to celebrate or criticize, the private family drama intensified, hidden just beneath the surface. And yet, for all the heartbreak, all the threats, and all the public spectacle, one question remained. How far would Meghan go to control the narrative? How much of what we saw was reality, and how much was carefully staged? And most importantly, what would happen when the next revelation came? One that would shock even those closest to the family. The answers to these questions would not be easy to face. The consequences of speaking out, the risks of silence, the heartbreak of betrayal, they were all intertwined in a story that was far from over. Thomas's heartbreak had only just begun, and the events that followed would push him further into the center of a storm he never sought, forcing the world to confront uncomfortable truths about family, loyalty, and the power of performance. But what Thomas revealed next would take everything to a whole new level, and no one, not even those who watched every tear on screen, saw it coming. Have you ever wondered what it takes to captivate millions, to make the world hang on every word you say, every tear you shed, every pause you take? For most people, it's a combination of raw emotion, timing, and luck. But for Meghan Markle, it was far more calculated. Behind the emotional narrative that played out on screens around the globe, there was a carefully orchestrated rehearsal process, a strategy designed not to convey truth, but to command perception. And at the center of that process was her father, Thomas Markle, a man who would become a reluctant witness to a drama the world mistook for reality. The story begins long before the cameras rolled. Weeks before the world tuned in, Meghan was already practicing. According to Thomas, she spent hours going over lines with PR consultants, perfecting each phrase, each breath, and each emotional inflection. She wanted every viewer to feel empathy, every journalist to bite, every headline to reflect a specific narrative. It wasn't a spontaneous conversation. It wasn't raw. It was meticulously designed. And Thomas, the man who had been part of her life since childhood, had seen the rehearsals firsthand. He knew what was coming before anyone else. Imagine the scene. A daughter pacing, pausing, speaking lines like an actor rehearsing for a role, while her father listens, heart sinking. There's an emotional dissonance that is almost unbearable. How do you respond when someone you've raised and loved is practicing grief, practicing vulnerability, as if it's a performance for an audience of millions? Thomas described it as surreal, heartbreaking, and confusing. He wanted to intervene, to guide her back to authenticity, but the dynamic had shifted. The rehearsals had become part of the plan, a necessary step in the grand narrative she was constructing. She would repeat lines over and over, adjusting tone and timing, sometimes asking Thomas for feedback. And every time she did, he felt an increasing sense of helplessness. How had it come to this? How had a daughter who once confided in him become someone who treated emotion like a prop, carefully adjusted for maximum impact? These rehearsals were not casual. They were strategic, designed to manipulate the audience's feelings and guide the story in precise directions. And it wasn't just about delivery. It was about content. The phrasing, the emotional beats, the pauses, all were calculated to achieve a specific reaction. I'm not exaggerating when I say she practiced the tears, Thomas revealed. Every line was considered. Every story beat was rehearsed. She even tried out the same words on me to see if they would land correctly. That is not the behavior of a person merely sharing feelings. It is the behavior of someone scripting reality for maximum narrative effect. It's important to understand the psychology at play here. Public perception is powerful. Millions of viewers forming opinions, influencing each other, sharing reactions on social media, all within minutes of an interview airing. Meghan understood this. She understood that by rehearsing lines and emotional reactions, she could guide audience sentiment, not merely share a personal experience. Thomas, on the other hand, understood something else, that this approach carried a cost. Emotional manipulation on a global scale is a powerful tool, but it comes with consequences, particularly for the family caught in the middle. Thomas tried to warn her. He expressed concern about the ethical implications, the personal ramifications, and the long-term impact on relationships. It's one thing to be honest, he told her. It's another to craft emotion like a scene in a movie. People will believe what they see, but the truth has a way of coming out. Meghan, according to Thomas, would listen politely but ultimately dismissed his advice. The rehearsals continued, undeterred, as if he were merely a bystander to a production she was determined to perfect. Consider the level of preparation involved. Each segment of the interview was meticulously mapped out, when to speak softly, when to pause for dramatic effect, when to display emotion, and when to let silence speak. Timing was everything. The pauses, those pregnant moments of reflection, were designed to draw viewers in, to make them lean forward, to make every word she said feel monumental. And behind those pauses were hours of practice, lines repeated and refined until they achieved the desired emotional resonance. Thomas saw it. He heard it. And yet, when the broadcast aired, the world assumed it was raw, unfiltered, spontaneous. The rehearsal process also extended to the manipulation of narrative arcs. Each story she told, each experience she shared, was strategically placed to build a crescendo of sympathy, to cast the royal family in a specific light, and to present herself as the central figure of victimhood and perseverance. It was narrative engineering on a massive scale. Thomas recognized it, and it pained him to see the world applauding and sympathizing without understanding the layers of construction behind the performance. And then there were the details that made Thomas particularly uneasy, the personal lines, shared with him in private, that were later aired to the world as confessions. Meghan had shared with him the exact wording she would use, asking for his reactions as though testing the efficacy of her performance. Every word she recited, every sentence constructed for maximum emotional impact, demonstrated not just preparation, but intention. She wasn't stumbling through an emotional moment. She was choreographing it. And the consequences were enormous, because millions would internalize this narrative as truth. What makes this story even more compelling is the intersection of personal and public stakes. Thomas was not only witnessing his daughter's rehearsals, he was also aware that these rehearsals were part of a larger plan to shape global opinion. This wasn't just an interview. It was a calculated attempt to control perception, to influence media narratives, and to manipulate public sympathy. And yet, for all the careful preparation, there was still the human element. The father who could see behind the curtain, who understood the gap between appearance and reality, who knew that what the world was seeing was a construction, not a confession. And therein lies the tension. The audience watching at home saw a vulnerable woman bravely sharing her story. Thomas saw a carefully constructed performance. Who was right? The public, seduced by emotion and presentation? Or the father, dismayed by the revelation of rehearsals and strategic planning? This question is central to understanding the heartbreak and the conflict. It's the question that drives the narrative forward, the one that forces viewers to grapple with the difference between perception and reality, between performance and truth. Thomas tried again to intervene. He offered advice, guidance, and perspective, all aimed at ensuring that the story remained truthful and that the personal cost was minimized. But Meghan's determination was absolute. The rehearsals continued. The lines were refined. Each pause was analyzed, each tear practiced, each story arc perfected. And when the cameras finally rolled, the performance was flawless, the emotional beats landing exactly as she intended, the narrative steering global opinion toward the story she wanted told. The aftermath of those rehearsals was immediate and far-reaching. Millions of viewers shared reactions, headlines erupted, and social media amplified the narrative to unprecedented levels. Yet the private fallout, the damage to family relationships, the heartbreak of a father silenced and threatened, remained largely invisible. For Thomas, the rehearsals were not a mere curiosity. They were the beginning of a fracture that would only widen as the consequences of the broadcast unfolded. And just when it seemed the rehearsals had run their course, just when the performance had reached its peak, Thomas discovered something even more unsettling. The rehearsals were only the beginning. Meghan had not only planned the emotional delivery, she had mapped out the public reaction, anticipated criticism, and designed contingencies for every possible scenario. Every statement, every interview, every public appearance was part of a master plan to control perception, to dominate the narrative, and to ensure that she remained at the center of attention, invulnerable to criticism. The level of planning, the meticulous attention to detail, and the personal cost to family relationships were staggering. Thomas had been a witness to a process that few could imagine, let alone understand. The rehearsals had been just the tip of the iceberg, and the implications were only beginning to emerge. The father who had once guided his daughter through life now found himself grappling with a complex mix of admiration, fear, heartbreak, and disbelief. And just when Thomas thought he had seen it all, when he believed he had understood the extent of the planning and manipulation, he discovered the next layer, the part that would ultimately force him to speak out publicly and risk everything. The rehearsals, the PR strategy, the careful orchestration, all of it was leading to a moment that the world would remember forever. A performance so meticulously designed that it would appear spontaneous, raw, and confessional, when in truth, it was anything but. What Thomas revealed next would shock not just the public, but those closest to the family. The rehearsals, it turned out, were more than preparation. They were a blueprint for manipulation, a strategy to influence global opinion, and a calculated move to reshape history in real time. And as the interview aired and the world reacted, Thomas understood that the stakes were higher than ever. Family, reputation, and the truth itself were now on the line, and the fallout would be devastating. But what came next would push the boundaries of betrayal and manipulation even further, and no one, not even Thomas, could have predicted the consequences that were about to unfold. What if everything you believed about someone you loved was carefully orchestrated? What if the emotions you thought were genuine were actually part of a script, rehearsed and perfected for maximum effect? For Thomas Markle, this wasn't a hypothetical question. It was his reality. He had watched, helplessly, as his daughter's performance captivated the world. But behind every tear, every pause, every quiver in her voice, he saw intention, a meticulous, deliberate orchestration. And yet, Even as he wrestled with anger and heartbreak, he wondered, was this manipulation or simply misunderstanding? The line between genuine emotion and calculated performance is thin, especially when the world is watching. To an audience, Meghan appeared raw, vulnerable, courageous. Every sob, every reflective pause, every mention of isolation or fear seemed authentic. Millions of people around the globe felt empathy, outrage, and sorrow. But Thomas, privy to the behind-the-scenes rehearsals, saw something different. A daughter who had planned every emotional beat, who had rehearsed her words like an actor preparing for a lead role. And it hurt. It wasn't only the manipulation that wounded him, it was the realization that the world might never know the truth. Thomas's perspective was complicated. On one hand, he understood why Meghan had done it. The pressure of royal life, the scrutiny of the public, and the desire to be heard on her terms could push anyone to carefully craft their message. On the other hand, he could not ignore the evidence. The rehearsals, the coaching, the recitation of lines in private before sharing them publicly. He felt caught between defending his daughter and revealing the reality of her actions. Could he accuse her of manipulation without seeming cruel? Could he stay silent without feeling complicit? Every option carried personal and public consequences. Consider the psychology behind the rehearsals. In many ways, Meghan's approach was not unusual for public figures, especially those under intense scrutiny. Celebrities, politicians, and media personalities often practice lines, plan pauses, and strategize emotional moments to maximize impact. But Thomas's concern was more personal. This wasn't just a public figure preparing for an audience. This was a daughter rehearsing pain, vulnerability, and emotional confessions in front of her father, transforming intimate family interactions into a performance designed for millions. That blurred the lines between personal trust and public strategy in ways that left Thomas both heartbroken and bewildered. The rehearsal sessions, as Thomas recalled, were exhaustive. Meghan would test her delivery, modify her expressions, and analyze his reactions. She wanted to know if the words landed correctly. Thomas said, "It wasn't just about me hearing them. It was about perfecting the way millions would perceive them." Imagine the emotional toll on a parent. Watching someone you raised, someone you nurtured, methodically work through lines of vulnerability, all while knowing the world would never see the context behind the performance. Each rehearsal was a reminder that your child had evolved into someone you barely recognized, a person who could wield emotion like a tool, with precision and intent. But here's the contradiction that haunted Thomas. Even as he wrestled with feelings of manipulation, he still loved his daughter. He still wanted to support her. He wanted to believe she was genuinely sharing her experiences, that the emotions were real beneath the rehearsed exterior. This duality, love and heartbreak, admiration and disbelief, created a constant tension within him. How could he reconcile his knowledge of rehearsals with the undeniable impact of the interview on the public? Was she manipulative, or simply navigating an impossible position with the best tools she had? This tension became more acute as Thomas considered the broader impact. The interview wasn't just a personal moment. It was a global event, dissected by media outlets, analyzed by pundits, and debated on social media. Public perception had been shaped by what appeared to be raw honesty. Headlines hailed her courage, viewers expressed outrage at the royal family, and the narrative gained momentum. And yet, the father who had witnessed the rehearsals firsthand knew the other side of the story. Millions of people were forming opinions based on a performance, not reality. And that realization, more than any headline, more than any criticism, cut Thomas the deepest. The emotional stakes were compounded by the threats he received. Meghan had warned him to remain silent, to stay in line, or risk losing access to her life entirely. Thomas was caught between his desire to protect his daughter and the imperative to share the truth. Every decision carried weight. Speak out, and he risked permanent estrangement. Stay silent, and he risked being complicit in a narrative he knew to be manipulated. The pressure was immense, and the emotional cost nearly unbearable. And then there was the question of intent. Was Meghan fully aware of how her rehearsals would be perceived? Did she intend to manipulate? Or was this an unfortunate side effect of preparation? Thomas wrestled with these questions endlessly. He recalled moments when Meghan appeared genuinely emotional during rehearsals, tiny cracks in the carefully constructed performance. Were those authentic feelings, or part of the act? Could someone feel real emotion while simultaneously rehearsing how to display it? The answer was unclear, but the consequences were undeniable. What made the situation even more complex was the public's lack of context. Millions reacted to the interview without knowing the rehearsals had taken place. They assumed vulnerability, authenticity, and courage. They did not know about the coaching sessions, the private line readings, or the strategic pacing of emotional beats. Thomas saw both sides, the crafted public image and the private reality. And every time he considered revealing the truth, he felt the weight of potential fallout, not just for Meghan, but for the entire family. There were moments when Thomas questioned himself. Was he being unfair? Was he reading too much into the rehearsals? Was it possible that Meghan's emotions, though rehearsed, were still real in their own way? Could performance and authenticity coexist? These were questions he grappled with constantly, torn between protecting the public from manipulation and protecting his daughter from public backlash. Each internal debate added to his heartbreak. And yet, as much as he wrestled with understanding her intent, the pattern of rehearsals and strategic planning was undeniable. Every segment, every tier, every pause, every phrase had been tested, refined, and perfected. The audience saw a confessional, Thomas saw a production. And that gap, the chasm between perception and reality, was the source of both his heartbreak and his decision to eventually speak out. By the time the interview aired, Thomas's worst fears were realized. The public was captivated, the media enthralled, and social media ablaze. Every line she had rehearsed landed precisely as intended. Every tear was met with empathy, and every story beat shaped the narrative. Thomas watched, knowing the truth behind the performance, and felt the profound ache of betrayal. Not because she shared her story, but because she had rehearsed it, refined it, and weaponized it to sway public opinion. And just when Thomas thought the situation could not become more complex, he discovered that the rehearsals were not just about public perception. They were about controlling the narrative, predicting criticism, and anticipating every possible reaction. Meghan had not only rehearsed what she would say, she had rehearsed how the world would respond, how the media would interpret her words, and how the royal family would react. The depth of planning, the calculated nature of the strategy, and the personal cost to Thomas as a father created an emotional storm he could hardly withstand. The question that haunted him, and the question that should haunt us as an audience, is this: was it manipulation or misunderstanding? Was this a daughter navigating impossible circumstances, or a calculated architect of perception? And when the rehearsals, strategy, and manipulation are revealed, how does the public reconcile their perception of authenticity with the reality of preparation? Thomas would spend sleepless nights asking himself these questions, knowing that the answers were complex, emotionally fraught, and perhaps impossible to fully untangle. And just when he thought he had seen every layer of planning and strategy, when he believed he understood the rehearsals, the PR, and the manipulation, he stumbled upon the next revelation, a detail so shocking, so calculated, that it would redefine his understanding of the entire interview and the intentions behind it. The next move in this story was about to take everything to a new level, and no one, not even Thomas, could have predicted what came next. What would you do if someone you loved most in the world suddenly turned that love into a weapon? What would you do if the person you raised, nurtured, and guided suddenly drew a line you were forbidden to cross, and that line carried consequences you could barely imagine? For Thomas Markle, that moment arrived in a single phone call, a call that would alter the trajectory of his relationship with his daughter forever. The interview had aired, millions had watched, and the world had reacted. Headlines praised, criticized, and dissected every moment of Meghan's performance. But for Thomas, the public reactions were secondary. What mattered most was what happened behind the scenes, the private fallout, the personal confrontation, the threat that would change everything. Meghan had rehearsed, prepared, and perfected her narrative, and now she was making it clear that she would defend it at any cost. The phone rang. Thomas, still reeling from the broadcast and the emotional strain of witnessing rehearsals and manipulation firsthand, answered with trepidation. On the other end was Meghan, composed, articulate, and unyielding. "If you speak out again," she said, her voice carrying both precision and intensity, "you are out of my life. Forever." The words were not a suggestion, not a warning to be taken lightly. They were a decree. A father who had tried to protect his daughter, who had offered guidance and counsel for decades, was suddenly being told that love and loyalty had conditions. Imagine that moment. A lifetime of love, guidance, and shared memories reduced to a single ultimatum delivered over the phone. A father suddenly faced with the impossible choice: stay silent and watch the narrative unfold, knowing the rehearsals and manipulations are hidden from the public, or speak out and risk permanent estrangement from the daughter he loves. The emotional weight of that threat is hard to overstate. Thomas described it as a shockwave that left him reeling, a stark realization that the relationship he had taken for granted could be severed at a single command. And yet, the threat was only the beginning. It carried with it an implicit understanding of the power dynamics that had shifted between them. The daughter who had once relied on her father's advice now held the leverage. She had cultivated a narrative so compelling, so emotionally charged, that she could dictate not just public perception, but private relationships as well. Thomas, despite his understanding of the rehearsals, the scripting, and the manipulation, had no power to influence the outcome without risking the relationship entirely. The emotional stakes could not have been higher. Thomas was torn between two forces: his desire to reveal the truth and his love for his daughter. Every instinct told him to speak out, to share what he knew about the rehearsals and the strategic construction of the interview. Every heartbeat reminded him of the cost of doing so: estrangement, heartbreak, and the irreversible loss of connection with the daughter he had raised. It was a tension few can imagine, a conflict that is both personal and profoundly public. The context of this threat is essential to understanding its gravity. For years, Thomas had been supportive, offering guidance, counsel, and love. He had celebrated his daughter's successes, consoled her through challenges, and tried to prepare her for the pressures of life in the public eye. And yet, all of that support and guidance had been overshadowed by the strategic construction of a narrative that excluded him from the public-facing story. Now, he was being told that any attempt to correct or reveal the truth could sever the bond permanently. It was more than a threat, it was a declaration of control. Imagine, too, the psychological impact. The parent who had once felt secure in the love and connection with their child now finds that connection contingent upon silence. The father who had hoped to offer perspective and clarity must now weigh every word, every thought, and every action against the possibility of being permanently cut off. It is a form of emotional coercion, subtle yet devastating. Thomas had experienced the rehearsals, the planning, and the performance firsthand. Now he was experiencing the consequences: fear, uncertainty, and heartbreak intertwined in a single, chilling moment. The threat also carried public implications. Thomas knew that if he spoke out, he would not only risk his relationship with Meghan but also enter the eye of a global media storm. Every statement he made would be scrutinized, dissected, and likely misrepresented. The rehearsals, the rehearsed lines, and the strategic planning could be dismissed as subjective interpretation. His personal pain would be reduced to a narrative competing with millions of others online. Speaking out was a risk, not just to family bonds, but to reputation and personal well-being. And yet, Thomas's love for his daughter made silence unbearable. He had witnessed rehearsals, lines repeated, and tears practiced, not just for public consumption, but in private moments that should have been reserved for intimacy and trust. He understood the impact of these rehearsals, the manipulation of narrative, and the emotional orchestration at play. To remain silent was to allow the story to unfold unchallenged, to permit the world to believe a version of reality carefully curated and rehearsed, with no regard for the personal cost to family. The threat itself was chilling in its clarity. "Out of my life forever," are words few fathers ever anticipate hearing from their children, yet Thomas heard them clearly, delivered without hesitation. The implication was unmistakable. Any deviation from her expectations would result in permanent estrangement. The father who had nurtured, guided, and protected his daughter was now at the mercy of her control, a stark inversion of the familial roles that had defined their relationship for decades. Thomas describes the aftermath of that phone call as a period of intense reflection, emotional turmoil, and cautious decision-making. He understood that this was more than a personal confrontation. It was a test of resilience, loyalty, and the boundaries of familial love. Every decision he made from that point forward would carry weight, consequences, and the potential to redefine his relationship with Meghan forever. And then there's the human side of the story. Beyond rehearsals, threats, and global perception, Thomas was a father grieving the loss of trust and closeness with his daughter. He felt the sting of isolation, the pain of being silenced, and the paradox of love intertwined with fear. How do you continue a relationship under such circumstances? How do you navigate love that comes with conditions, loyalty that is contingent, and communication that carries a hidden cost? Thomas was forced to confront questions that have no easy answers. Yet, despite the threat, the world did not see the private agony. Social media debated Meghan's narrative, analysts dissected every word, and millions formed opinions based on the broadcast alone. The human cost, the heartbreak, fear, and isolation Thomas experienced was invisible to the public, and that invisibility amplified the pain, creating a dissonance between public perception and private reality. He was both a witness and a victim, watching as the world celebrated the narrative he knew to be orchestrated while grappling with the threat that silenced him from sharing the full truth. The consequence of that single call extended far beyond the immediate moment. It reshaped their relationship, redefined the boundaries of communication, and introduced an unspoken tension that would linger for years. Thomas now existed in a delicate balance: speak and risk permanent loss, or remain silent and endure the knowledge of manipulation. It was a burden few could comprehend, a test of emotional endurance that would shape the rest of his life. And even as he processed the threat, Thomas realized something even more profound. The call was not just about silencing him. It was a demonstration of the larger strategy at play. Every rehearsal, every line, every pause, and every tear had been designed to influence perception, control narrative, and assert dominance, not just in the public eye, but within the family itself. The threat was the private manifestation of the same principles that had guided the rehearsals: control, precision, and strategic execution. Thomas knew he could no longer ignore the truth. He had to weigh his options, consider the risks, and decide how to respond to a daughter who had both captivated the world and threatened him in equal measure. And that decision would not be simple. It would require courage, clarity, and an understanding that the personal stakes were intertwined with a public spectacle of unprecedented scale. And then came the moment that changed everything: a realization that the rehearsals, the strategy, and the threat were only part of a larger story. A story that had been unfolding for years, carefully concealed behind polished smiles, carefully edited interviews, and global fascination. What Thomas discovered next would push the boundaries of betrayal, manipulation, and public perception even further, and no one, not even him, could have anticipated the full magnitude of the consequences. The storm was only beginning. Have you ever wondered what really happens when the cameras are off, when the headlines fade, and the world isn't watching? Behind the carefully curated images, the public appearances, and the viral clips, there is often a story far darker, far more complicated, and far more human than anyone could imagine. For Thomas Markle, the events surrounding the Oprah interview revealed an entire world of royal drama that the public could only guess at, but he lived it firsthand. While millions were focused on Meghan's performance, Thomas saw the hidden mechanics: the planning sessions, the rehearsed lines, the strategic timing, and the ways those rehearsals intersected with the private lives of the royal family. What the public witnessed as vulnerability and courage was often a carefully constructed narrative designed to manipulate perception, shield reputations, and control the story on a global scale. Behind the scenes, Thomas realized, was a world where appearances were everything, private family bonds were fragile, and trust was constantly tested. It begins with the understanding that the royal family is not just a family. It is an institution, a centuries-old system with rules, expectations, and pressures that are unimaginable to most people. Meghan, entering that world, faced extraordinary scrutiny. Every interaction, every expression, and every decision could be scrutinized, criticized, and sensationalized. Thomas understood that to navigate such a world, it might feel necessary to plan every move, to rehearse, and to protect oneself with a narrative that shields against public judgment. But what he didn't understand was how far that planning would go, how calculated it would be, and how it would impact the people closest to her. Thomas recalls being privy to private conversations meant to be personal and intimate, which were instead strategically crafted to reinforce the public narrative. Meghan, aware of cameras, journalists, and the relentless scrutiny, would discuss what she planned to say, how she would present herself, and what reaction she expected. These discussions often included him, but not as a confidant, more as a participant in rehearsals for a performance that would dominate headlines. The lines between personal trust and professional strategy blurred to the point where it was nearly impossible to distinguish one from the other. The behind-the-scenes drama extended beyond the rehearsals. It seeped into relationships with the royal family. According to Thomas, Meghan's careful crafting of her narrative included anticipating responses from various members of the monarchy. Every anecdote, every emotional beat, and every pause was calculated not only to influence the audience, but also to position her story in relation to the royal family's public image. What the world saw as confessions of vulnerability were, in fact, strategic moves on a chessboard designed to shape public perception and protect her position while subtly undermining others. Consider the implications of this. The royal family, despite their global stature and experience with public scrutiny, were blindsided by the precision of Meghan's narrative. Members of the household, advisors, and public relations teams may have had some awareness of the interview's content, but the rehearsals and strategic planning revealed by Thomas suggest a level of control over the narrative that exceeded anyone's expectations. It was not merely a story about personal experience. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign to influence global perception, reputation, and legacy. Thomas describes moments where he realized the full extent of the orchestration. Lines that seemed spontaneous to the audience were anything but. Every story about isolation, distress, or personal conflict was crafted to maximize empathy, frame certain family members in a particular light, and evoke predictable reactions. The interview was more than just an account of personal struggles. It was a calculated performance, a narrative designed to resonate deeply with viewers, while subtly guiding opinions about both Meghan and the royal family. And then there's the tension between private truth and public image. Thomas, witnessing these rehearsals and strategic maneuvers, felt a growing sense of isolation and frustration. The people closest to the story, the family, were often kept out of the decision-making process, left to react after the fact. Private conversations became rehearsals, personal grievances became narrative tools, and the emotional stakes were magnified by the knowledge that millions of viewers would form judgments based on what was presented. It was a world where authenticity and performance collided, and Thomas, as both father and insider, was caught in the middle. The personal toll was immense. For a father who had nurtured and guided his daughter, watching these calculated moves unfold was heartbreaking. Every line rehearsed, every tear practiced, every strategic pause was a reminder that the intimacy and trust they once shared had been transformed into a performance. Thomas felt powerless to influence the narrative, to correct misunderstandings, or to protect relationships that were being strained by a story being told on an international stage. This behind-the-scenes drama extended beyond personal relationships into the realm of public perception. Thomas knew that millions of people would see Meghan's performance and interpret it as genuine, raw, and authentic. Headlines would praise her courage, critics would analyze her story, and social media would amplify the narrative endlessly. But the truth, the rehearsals, the strategic planning, the private coercion, remained invisible to the audience. Thomas's frustration stemmed not just from a sense of personal betrayal, but from the knowledge that the public was consuming a carefully curated version of reality, unaware of the manipulation involved. The drama wasn't confined to rehearsals or public appearances. Thomas also observed how Meghan navigated internal family dynamics, balancing public performance with private tensions. Every interaction with family members, every discussion with advisors, and every decision about what to reveal and when was part of a larger strategy. It was not simply about sharing personal experience. It was about positioning herself, controlling perception, and ensuring that her narrative remained dominant. The stakes were enormous, both personally and professionally. And yet, despite the meticulous planning, there were moments of vulnerability, moments where the human side of Meghan broke through. Thomas recalls seeing glimpses of the daughter he knew, a person capable of warmth, fear, and genuine emotion. But those moments were fleeting, almost imperceptible, overshadowed by the layers of strategy and control. They served as reminders that behind the rehearsals and the performance, there was still a human being, a daughter, a family member, someone he loved and struggled to understand. Thomas also grappled with the contradictions inherent in the situation. How could someone be both rehearsing their story and experiencing genuine emotion at the same time? How could public perception diverge so sharply from private reality? The rehearsals, the planning, and the execution were intended to control how the world saw Meghan, yet they also introduced tension and conflict within the family. It was a delicate balancing act, and Thomas, as both witness and participant, felt the emotional weight acutely. The culmination of these behind-the-scenes revelations was a profound understanding. The narrative presented to the world was only a fragment of a much larger story. Rehearsals, strategic planning, and controlled disclosures were not just about shaping public perception. They were about protecting, manipulating, and sometimes controlling the relationships closest to her. Thomas realized that what appeared as vulnerability and honesty on screen was, in reality, part of a carefully managed system designed to achieve specific outcomes for Meghan, regardless of the cost to family or trust. And just when it seemed Thomas had comprehended the full extent of the strategy, he uncovered another layer. A private conversation, a subtle indication, a hidden plan that suggested the performance was far from over. The rehearsals, the careful orchestration, and the threats were all pieces of a puzzle, leading to a revelation that would shock even those who believed they understood the situation. The world had seen the performance, but Thomas had seen the architecture behind it. And the truth he had witnessed, the truth of the rehearsals, the private conversations, and the strategic control, was about to collide with public perception in ways that no one, not even the family, could have anticipated. What came next would escalate the drama to a level few could have imagined, and it would leave Thomas facing decisions no parent should ever have to make. What happens when private family moments, long hidden and never meant to be shared, suddenly become public property? What happens when a father, once a silent witness to his daughter's rehearsals and rehearsed confessions, decides to reveal what he knows? For Thomas Markle, those questions became a painful reality. The rehearsals were only the beginning. Behind the scripted tears, the practiced pauses, and the public narrative, there were secrets, family secrets, that had been carefully guarded, but now threatened to explode into the public eye. Thomas had always tried to protect his daughter. He had been a shield, a guide, and a confidant, advising her through decisions large and small. But he had also witnessed patterns that troubled him deeply. The rehearsals for the Oprah interview revealed not only her strategic precision, but also a willingness to manipulate emotions, to craft reality for public consumption, and to position herself at the center of every story. And yet, beneath all the performance, there were deeper truths, stories about family interactions, private grievances, and personal conflicts that had been ignored or hidden for years. The moment Thomas realized the magnitude of these secrets was sobering. He had seen, firsthand, how small disagreements or misunderstandings had been magnified in private, then repurposed for public narrative. He knew the ways in which Meghan had selectively presented information, omitted context, and framed family interactions to support the story she wanted the world to hear. And it wasn't just about public perception, it was about relationships. He recognized that these omissions and reframings had the power to harm trust, manipulate emotions, and leave lasting wounds within the family. Some of these secrets were simple, almost mundane, but when revealed in the wrong context, they became explosive. Family arguments that were private, moments of frustration between siblings, and personal anxieties that had been shared in confidence were all repurposed as evidence in a narrative designed for public consumption. Thomas found himself weighing the ethics of revealing these secrets against the imperative to defend the truth. Every decision carried risk: speak and risk being accused of betrayal, or stay silent and allow a narrative to solidify that misrepresented both his daughter and the family. One of the most painful secrets involved intimate family dynamics that had never been meant for the public eye. Thomas had witnessed private disagreements between Meghan and her family, arguments over support, misunderstandings about intentions, and conflicts about personal choices. In the context of the interview, these private moments were reframed as evidence of dysfunction, painting certain family members in a negative light while elevating Meghan as the central figure of struggle and triumph. Knowing this, Thomas felt compelled to speak, but the weight of doing so was immense. He also knew that the family secrets were more than just personal grievances, they were leverage. The same strategic thinking that had guided the rehearsals now applied to the selective disclosure of these secrets. By controlling what information reached the public, Meghan could shape perception, influence media narratives, and assert control over relationships. Thomas understood the power of this leverage, and it was deeply unsettling. He realized that revealing even fragments of the truth could shift the narrative dramatically, exposing both manipulation and vulnerability in ways that were impossible to predict. The public, of course, saw only the polished version of events. Millions watched as Meghan recounted struggles with the royal family, spoke of isolation and distress, and positioned herself as both courageous and wronged. Headlines praised her bravery, social media erupted with empathy, and public opinion shifted rapidly in her favor. But Thomas knew that behind each statement lay context, nuance, and history that the public could never see. The rehearsals, the strategic planning, and the careful framing had concealed these family secrets, presenting a curated reality that left millions of viewers unaware of what had truly occurred. Some of the family secrets were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet their impact was profound. Private conversations, confessions, and disagreements that had taken place in confidence were now weaponized in the broader narrative. The omission of certain details, the framing of events, and the strategic use of emotional beats all contributed to a version of reality that was carefully managed but emotionally devastating for those involved. Thomas understood that revealing these truths publicly was fraught with risk, not just for his daughter, but for the entire family. And yet, the secrets could not remain hidden forever. The rehearsals, the strategic planning, and the careful construction of the narrative had created a pressure cooker environment. Emotions, grievances, and tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface were now poised to erupt. Thomas realized that in order to preserve integrity, he had to take a stand. He had to reveal what he knew, not to harm his daughter, but to present context, to clarify manipulation, and to expose the truth behind the public performance. This decision was not easy. Thomas weighed the consequences of every statement, every revelation, and every disclosure. He considered the impact on relationships, public perception, and his own sense of responsibility. And yet, despite the fear, he understood that the truth had to be told. The family secrets, the manipulations, and the rehearsals all pointed to a larger pattern, one that the public deserved to know, even if it risked personal pain and estrangement. Some of the most shocking revelations involved private confessions and personal anxieties that had been transformed into public narrative. What had been moments of vulnerability within the family were now positioned as evidence of dysfunction or victimhood. Thomas saw the deliberate framing, the omissions, and the strategic use of emotional beats as tools to shape perception. And he knew that without intervention, these family secrets would continue to be distorted, further complicating relationships and public understanding. As Thomas prepared to speak, he was acutely aware of the stakes. The revelation of family secrets would not only expose manipulation, but also risk further estrangement from his daughter. It would challenge the narrative that millions of people had come to accept as truth. It would confront the public with the reality that rehearsals, strategic planning, and manipulation had played a central role in shaping perception. And it would force the world to grapple with the complexities of family, loyalty, and honesty in ways few could imagine. But revealing these secrets was not just about correcting the narrative. It was about preserving personal integrity. Thomas understood that his silence would allow a curated reality to dominate, a reality that misrepresented both him and the family. Speaking out, despite the risk, was a matter of principle, of truth, and of conscience. It was an acknowledgement that while public perception can be powerful, the reality behind the scenes is what defines relationships, trust, and accountability. And just when Thomas thought he had prepared for every possible outcome, he uncovered yet another revelation. A secret so explosive, so deeply personal, that it threatened to upend not only the family narrative, but the very way the world understood the events surrounding the interview. It was a hidden truth, buried beneath rehearsals, strategic planning, and public perception, waiting for the moment to surface. The stakes had never been higher. Family bonds, public perception, and the truth itself were now intertwined in a drama that had global attention. Thomas had taken the first step in revealing family secrets, but he knew the consequences were only beginning. The world would react, relationships would strain, and the carefully constructed narrative would face unprecedented scrutiny. What Thomas revealed next would challenge everything the public thought they knew, exposing layers of deception, manipulation, and hidden motives that few could have anticipated.